Well, I'm not going to say stupid, but, well, I just did. Just because something's true doesn't mean that it's helpful. It's bullshit. Comics can be weird as fuck. As someone who's trying to get better at teaching other people to complete their comics without burning out, I'll often have a look at what other people are saying about the topics of comic and art. It's always good to look for different perspectives and challenge your own viewpoints. But some of the advice that I've seen people give in 2024 isn't just bad, it's actively hurting people. So I'm going to go over what that advice is and give an alternative view that I think is better. So the first one is to draw for X amount of hours per day. Now, this is a really common one, and I used to subscribe to this idea really hard. I'd hear that you should draw for a certain number of hours every day in order to get good, and I took this advice to heart, and I would draw for like 2 hours every day regardless of what was going on in my life. It didn't matter if I was tired, in pain, if I had worked the next morning, whether I neglected my relationships. I had it in me that I needed to draw for this length of time because that's what I'd been told by the people that I looked up to. And it's bullshit. There is no specific length of time that you need to draw for every day. It's a myth. In fact, you don't even need to draw every day. The amount of time that you should draw for is the amount of time that you're able to draw for. That's pretty much it. There will be some days where you can only spare 10 minutes and some days where you can spare 10 hours. And some days you can't spare a single second. All of these scenarios are fine and you will get better at drawing even if you can't draw for X number of hours every single day. Just draw. So this is one of the most frustrating pieces of advice that I've heard. You ask, how do I get better at art? They say, just draw. But draw what? Everything, all the time. Wow, that's helpful. The trouble of giving advice like this is that just because something's true doesn't mean that it's helpful. And advice should be helpful. Yes, just drawing is going to make you better at drawing, but when people ask the question of how do you get better at art, they're looking for something a bit more specific than just draw. So here's my prescription for someone who is relatively new at art or comics and they want to know how to get better. So step 1, draw what makes you happy. The reason that's so important is because one of the biggest things to get you from being a complete novice to being somewhat good at drawing is keeping you going and keeping your momentum. And if you're just doing studies that you find really boring, you're probably not going to continue drawing. So draw what makes you happy and draw what makes you interested. That includes making comics that interest you as opposed to comics that you think are going to be popular. They're two different things. And then when you've been doing that for a little while, pay attention to things that you found a little bit easier and pay attention to the things that you found a little bit harder. And then when it comes to finding tutorials, pay attention to the things that you found harder until they start to become things that you find easier. And that is your compass for what you should study next. So draw what makes you happy, figure out the stuff that pisses you off, study that thing, repeat. That's it. Those two are sort of general art things. This one's more about comics, where there's a lot of advice out there that I've read where there is nowhere near enough focus on the thumbnails. It's all about the inking and the drawing and the coloring because that's the stuff that looks the prettiest. And I understand why people create tutorials about that stuff because they can show it off, whereas the thumbnail kind of just looks like a mess. So I get it. But I also think that the advice of skipping over the thumbnails and trying to almost race towards the inks is, well, I'm not going to say stupid, but, well, I just did. The thing is, thumbnails are the beating heart of your comic. They basically set your comic up for success or failure based on how much thought and attention you give them. I've done quite a few videos on thumbnails and my advice is to watch those because I still stand by what I say in them. But the TLDR of those videos, if you don't have time or you can't be bothered, is that you should spend as much time, if not more, on your thumbnails than you do on your pencils and inks. It will make your pencils and inks faster to do for a start, and also much better if you have a clearer idea of what they're going to look like in the thumbnail stage. That's why thumbnails are so important. Normalising pain. Now this one I found really weird actually, but when I think back to my early 20s, I absolutely would have subscribed to this idea that being in pain and feeling achy and stuff is almost like a badge of honor for artists because it shows that you're working so hard, which is insane. It doesn't show that you're working hard. It shows that you're not taking breaks and that you're going to end up ruining your wrist and your back and your neck, and you're probably not going to be able to do this long term. So I don't know if it's advice necessarily, but I just wanted to point out that feeling pain is not a normal part of the process. And if you feel twinges and aches and pains, then you should stop. because those twinges and pains and aches are not going to go away on their own. And so if you work through them, you're just going to make them worse. And if you don't rest enough, those pains and aches are going to come back much quicker and much harder. And it's going to be a lot more difficult to actually make your comic. So anytime that you're starting to feel a bit stiff and a bit achy, get up from your seat and just walk around and take a 5-minute break. I don't care how far along you are in your comic. I don't care if you've set yourself an arbitrary deadline that you have to meet. The deadline doesn't matter compared to your physical and mental health, because there'll always be another deadline. There won't be another body. And if you're getting like really intense pain, then go and see a medical professional. Your comic will wait for you while you get yourself sorted out. Your back, wrist, and neck won't. Which brings us nicely onto this next piece of advice, which again is sort of not necessarily advice, but kind of like a way of thinking about creating art and being an artist. And I think it also ties into this whole hustle culture idea, which thankfully isn't as pertinent as it used to be, but it's still there. And it's always kind of been there around the art space. A lot of us tie up our identity with being a comic creator or an artist. Without my art, who am I? And I get that. But that sort of thinking enables us to prioritize our art and our comics over ourselves, and that's simply not sustainable. Yes, you might get that page finished, but if you neglect your sleep, then you're going to regret that more. Your health is the single best investment you can make as an artist. We create with our mind and our body, so the better you take care of those things, the better your art and comics will be. Your comics will thank you for doing that, and they will suffer if you suffer. Next piece of advice. Should you work for free? You shouldn't work for free. Right, what's the next one? Okay, I'll expand on that a little bit. There are some instances where working for free is really beneficial, but most of the time, it's simply not worth it. The only time that I could really think where working for free is going to really help you out is if you're really new to comics, either as a writer or an artist, and you're working for free with somebody else on like a 20-page comic. That I think is a really worthwhile thing to do because it gives you a lot of experience and it can push you forwards and it can bulk up a portfolio. Like you get a lot of value out of that, even if you're not getting paid. But if it's a grand epic, which to be honest, most adverts are for, because that's what most people want to do first, then I just think it's really not worth it because you're going to be stuck with that comic for at least a year, if not more, not getting paid. And not getting paid for creating something that you are not passionate about is really hard to maintain. So I would not recommend doing that. Maybe you're concerned that if you don't work for free, then people are simply not going to take you up on your services, that you're not going to find work unless you work for free. And I understand that pressure a lot, but unless you're working on short projects that only last a couple of months, then just don't work for free. And if you really can't find any work anywhere, then just take a public domain IP and draw it yourself if you're an artist. And to be honest, even if you're a writer, then either learn to draw and make the comic yourself. It won't take that long to learn to draw enough to make a basic comic, or turn your comic into a novel. A writer friend of mine did exactly that because they were making their comic, realized that it became a little bit too unsustainable financially, and so they turned their comic into a novel. Was it exactly what they wanted at the time? No, but he's still being able to tell his story, and he has the option to turn it into a comic later on down the line when he does have the funds for it. So this idea that you have no choice but to work for free or that you should pay your dues, I think is pretty much nonsense. The only reason really that you should work for free is if you feel that there's an opportunity to learn a lot from the person that you're working with, and ideally that project is short. Otherwise, charge what you think is fair. This next one is something that I've talked about quite a lot recently. It's this idea that you need to get good at drawing before you start your comic. You don't. You can never have drawn in your life and still make a comic. Nobody said that comics need to look like the most professional superhero or manga comics that are out there. They don't. And if they all did, the comics would be really boring. Comics can be weird as fuck. They can be abstract or cartoons or symbolic representations of things. You don't need to be a professional artist with years under your belt to get started. Good comics are not defined by good technical drawings. Good comics are visual stories that are told well. That is it. Now, good drawings and a good artist can help enhance those stories, but it's not an absolute requirement for you to try to tell your stories. So make a comic and get better at the same time. Page per day. So this is something that I used to look at quite a lot when I was younger, is like what's the standard output for a comic artist. Like, how many pages should I do a day or a week or a month or whatever? And the most common piece of advice that I kept seeing come up was that most artists tend to do about a page per day, and that's like a good rate of production. And the reason that I don't like that piece of advice is because I don't feel that it comes from artists. I feel that it comes from publishers, because it's sort of telling you what certain publishers expect from the artist. I personally have a big grievance with publishers, which makes it sound like I'm really salty. Maybe I got rejected or anything. I haven't been rejected. This is just through the stories that so many comic creators say about publishers treating them in both the traditional format as well as on webtoons and other webcomic variants. And so I have a bit of a bee in my bonnet when it comes to publishers. I think that they treat their artists quite appallingly. And I think artists who regurgitate this sort of thing, like you should create a page per day, are being gaslit into thinking that that's normal. You might be in a hot streak and be able to create a page a day, or you might have figured out in the first instance that if you draw in a particular style, then you can get more pages out, and both of those are absolutely fine. But to suggest that you need to draw a page per day in order to make a comic that's sustainable is not realistic, and it's not sustainable for the artist. Especially if you're not full-time, you're going to really struggle to keep that up over a long period of time. So just make comics at your own pace to the best of your abilities. Don't use 3D or references. It still blows my mind that people genuinely think that using references or 3D is cheating. They think that you should just be able to draw everything ever from your mind, and very, very few people in the world can actually do that. For me, the best advice I heard about references is that the purpose of them is to turn a good drawing into a great drawing. Like, a good drawing without reference can become a great drawing with reference. So that's the sort of holistic view of why we would use references. In terms of how to use references, my advice for references is to use them to double check what you've already drawn. So if you draw a character in a particular pose, but something looks a little bit off, then try and find a reference of someone in a similar pose and then make the corrections if you need them. If you're in a position where you can't even start a drawing without first getting the references, I think that's the wrong way around. And you should try and flip that by practicing the fundamentals a little bit more and then using references to make the corrections as you go. And as you do that, you'll start picking up all these things and you'll stop making those mistakes anyway. So it's a really good way of learning. And when it comes to 3D, particularly in comics, a lot of comic creators use 3D. I use 3D. The only reason that I use 3D, I can't speak for them, but the only reason I use 3D is to speed things up. That's literally the only reason. It's the same reason why I'm creating comics digitally. It's that, and also I don't have a lot of room in my house. This is my living room. Like, my sofa is literally right there. The TV is right there. That's it. So I don't have room to put pages and pages and pages of stuff in, because my wife would kill me. But also, it's quicker, it's more efficient, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with trying to find ways to speed up your process, because as comic creators, you're drawing thousands and thousands of drawings over and over and over again. So if you can find a way to make that slightly faster and slightly more efficient, then go for it. Like, this isn't the same as using AI, and I can't be bothered with that argument anymore. I've already done 2 videos on AI, and I just can't be bothered. I'm too tired. So let's move on. You have to use insert software here. Personally, I think that Clip Studio Paint is the best software for comic artists. If anyone asks me what software to get, that's always the first one that I say. But that doesn't mean that you need to use it in order to create comics. Some people like Critter because it's free. Some people like Photoshop because it's Adobe. And some people like Paint Shop Pro because they got it in 1994 and they don't like change. The software ultimately doesn't matter. It's the user that matters. It's about how comfortable you are within the software that you use. A comic creator friend of mine still uses Comic Life Pro, and I personally don't like Comic Life Pro anymore because I think Clip Studio Paint is better, but they prefer using Comic Life Pro. And the thing is, we're both correct. And if anyone looks down their nose at you because of the software that you use, then kindly invite them to walk into the sea. Now, these ones were the ones I was able to find across the internet, but I also wanted to know what other people were being told by other creators, and so I asked people on my Discord as well as on Reddit the kind of advice that they've been given. And some of these are insane. If you want to learn how to draw, don't study anime or manga. They do everything wrong. For anyone who is particularly young and they like to draw anime and manga, and they show their portfolio or their sketchbook to an artist who is older than them and more skilled and all that shit, they'll almost always say, stop drawing manga, stop drawing anime. And I'd like to think that it comes from a good place because there is some wisdom there, but it also feels like it's an attack on anime and manga because a lot of artists kind of dismiss it as an art style. So I understand why people get so defensive about it, but there is truth in that you shouldn't just draw anime and manga, because in order to learn the fundamentals, you have to learn from the real world and you have to learn from around you, because there are certain rules in life, in the way that we perceive things. There's a lot of commonality in the way that we perceive things. And so if you learn that, then it's like you're learning a common language. So we all roughly know how a body is put together. We understand that they tend to have 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, etc. And they tend to be certain proportions and all that sort of stuff, which is why learning real world anatomy is really important. Because then when you understand how a human works in terms of anatomy, then you can understand how to stylize it in terms of anime. And this isn't just anime, by the way, this is any stylization, but it seems that anime gets a lot of the attention because obviously it's huge, it's really popular. But this would apply if you were to draw in the same style as The Simpsons or Family Guy or Futurama or a cartoon that didn't appear in the 90s. What's a modern cartoon? Oh God, I'm old. What's a modern cartoon? I don't want to use Google for this. Gravity Falls, there you go. But also to say that you shouldn't learn from manga and anime does come from a place of ignorance, because there is a lot that you can learn from drawing anime and manga. Inking and line work and line of action and visual storytelling and movement and shape design and color and character design and all these things manga and anime can teach you. And there's probably loads more that I'm forgetting. So yeah, I think that's bad advice. Well, it's good advice, but told in a bad way. You should study the fundamentals alongside drawing anime and manga, and then use that knowledge to stylize and create your own anime and manga. That's a better way of saying it, I think. Next, what do you want to draw feet for? You'll never do that unless it's a beach scene or something. That's a really weird piece of advice, isn't it? So it's basically saying you shouldn't draw feet unless you're doing like a beach scene or a scene where the character's feet will be exposed in some way. And when I read this, I didn't really know how to react, but it instantly made me think of Rob Liefeld, who notoriously is not great at drawing feet and will hide them a lot behind like a bush or out of shot or something. And I get it, feet are difficult to draw and it can be really tempting to just not draw them ever. But you'll never get comfortable drawing them if you always avoid drawing them all the time, and your audience will notice after a while. We noticed with Rob Liefeld. So also, you should learn to draw things even if they're being covered up by other things. So obviously feet tend to be covered up by socks and shoes, so why do you need to learn like the intricacies of the toes and all that sort of stuff? But they all influence how the foot is shaped, so that is important. It's just a really ignorant, strange thing for this person to say. They were doing a drawing workshop as well, according to this comment, so that's a really bizarre tip to give on anatomy, is just to not draw feet. It's dumb. Draw feet. As gross as they are and as difficult as they are to draw, you should draw them anyway. So next one, change work and become an economist. This one made me chuckle because my dad's an economist, but also it was kind of a sad chuckle. Like, yeah, the chances of you making a living as a comic creator are low. Like, they are really low. That's just the reality of it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the lack of education within this comic space, because I think a lot of people still feel that the old way is still the most relevant way, where you build up a comic script or a comic outline or even a completed comic, present that to a publisher, hope they take it, and then you ride off into the sunset. And that's just not how it works anymore. Because one, the chances of you being picked up are quite slim, because like DC and Marvel and these big publishers, they get submissions all the time and they reject the vast majority of them. But even if your story does get picked up and it does get published by a big publisher, that's still not a guarantee that you're going to make much money. There are a lot of people online who are not just being published, but they are award-winning comic creators, and they still had to get a second job to make ends meet. Like, there just isn't enough money in comics for whatever reason. I have my theories, but I'm not going to say them because I don't have any evidence for them whatsoever. They're just my feelings. But what I can say is that I think What comic creators should do, well, there's two things that they should do. First of all, don't get into comics if you think you're going to make money from it. If that's your main goal as a comic creator, do something else, man. Become an economist, because you'll make that transition from earning nothing to earning a lot of money much easier than if you were to just make comics and try and make money through comics. The second thing is to try and take control of the audience. Don't sort of parlay that responsibility to a publisher, because I just don't think it's worth it. I think it's a much better investment to try and build up your own audience first and publish through your own means, or through as much of your own means as possible, because one, you'll have a bit more control over your intellectual property, and two, you'll be able to take more money from your comic because you won't have to share it with a publisher. I might make a completely separate video from that, because I do think, like, if you look at artists, comic artists out there who have done this themselves, like the first one that comes to mind is Star Pritchard. She's the Starfish face on YouTube. Look at how she's done it. Like, I think that's a pretty good example of how to do it. The main drawback is it's probably going to take you 8 years. But if you're passionate about creating comics, then it shows that it is possible to make a full-time living from your comic. And you don't need a big, horrible publisher to do it. Next. Concentrate on comics for young kids, because those are the only types of graphic novels being bought anymore anyway. So take your finished script and age it down to 13 or under. I really don't like this advice, mostly because it's, again, looking at comics through the sole lens of making money. Like, you should make your comic more marketable, and so therefore you should completely change it to fit this market. Now, one, that implies that there's just one market for comics, which is clearly wrong. But also, if you're going to change your comic wholesale just so that you've got the chance of making more money in the back end, then you're just not going to have a good time making your comic. You're going to be stuck with this comic for at least a year, probably longer. And unless it's something that you're interested in, you're not going to have a good time. And so I just don't think that's worth it. The amount of money you get on the back end, even if you got like $500,000, I just don't think that's worth it, because you're going to be miserable for a year or 2 years and there's no guarantee at the end of it. It's kind of similar to YouTube. Like, there are a certain style of video and thumbnail and title that gets more views, and we all know what those videos are. But I'm not going to start doing those videos for that reason, because I'm not chasing views. I'm making videos that I feel passionate about, and that's why I've been able to do it for 3 years without any money. But if my only goal was to make money, then these last 3 years would be horrible. And it's hard enough as it is. Anyway, next. The worst advice I ever got was, don't just meet the deadline so you have some little stupid design ready for fluke or whatever. You have to perfect every panel of every page, even if it takes years. Oh boy. If anyone encourages perfectionism in artists, then they should not be allowed to talk to other people anymore. Because that's one of the most damaging things that you can do to an artist, because the majority of us fall victim to perfectionism at some point in our creative lives, and some of us live with it forever, and some of us have bouts of it where we're really precious and just can't finish a piece because it's not perfect. And that will stop you from completing pretty much anything. So that means it will stop you improving, and it will stop you learning, and it will destroy your enjoyment of art. But like all things, there is balance. It's not good to aim for perfection, but it's equally not good to just half-ass your comic just for the sake of getting it out quickly. Finding that balance is really difficult to do, because you don't always know whether you're leaning towards the perfectionism side of things or whether you're leaning towards the half-assing it side of things. For me personally, I think that if you can be honest with yourself and honest with your current abilities today, and you finish a panel or an illustration and you genuinely felt that you did the best you could with what you have, then move on to the next thing. That's a good sign that something's finished, basically. And if you're honest with yourself and say, okay, I half-assed this, then maybe consider redrawing it. But you're never going to get that perfect. As Dan Berry said, just make sure things are finished, not perfect. This one, start small. I want to make what I want. So I included this one because this is the only piece of advice that I pretty much 100% disagree with, which is to say that I agree with it. I disagree with the person who posted it, but I agree with the advice. So this person's obviously heard the advice that they should start small when it comes to making their own comics. And they thought it wasn't just bad advice, but it was the worst advice that they'd received, which I think is a bit over the top. but fair enough. And I understand the impulse that you want to make what you want. You don't want to be dictated to by other people, and that's fine. You don't have to take advice if you don't want to. But the reason why you start small is so that you can learn how to do it. So then when it comes to you creating your big, grand, epic graphic novel, you have the tools and the knowledge in place to be able to do that. That's literally the only reason. There's no other hidden agenda. There's no agenda telling you that you should start small, because why? And it's that reason why I recommend that people start with a 6-page comic before they do their big comic, even if it's taking a small scene from that big comic and going through the process of completing a comic, just using that scene in a 6-page sample almost. Because if they do it that way, they're going to be much better set up to complete their big comic. That's literally the only reason why. So I respectfully disagree with that person, because I don't think that's bad advice. I think it's actually very good advice. Art advice, and especially comic advice, is really difficult to both give and receive, especially on places like YouTube, because it has to be quite broad and it has to be quite vague. So that's why I'm trying not to be overly critical about the advice that's been given online, because unless you know the person or you've been working with them for a one-to-one basis, you're not going to be able to give like exact advice that's going to help their specific situation. So you have to sort of talk in broad terms. So I get all of that. And I think that most artists who give advice are generally really well-meaning and they're not malicious at all. You may have heard some of the advice that I've mentioned in this video, and it's been life-changingly positive for you, and that's great. And for some of you, you may have tried some similar things that have been mentioned and it's made things a lot worse. From my point of view, I think the majority of the advice that I've mentioned in this video is broadly bad, and it's unfortunately common, but you're free to disagree with that. But my passing advice for 2024 is that when it comes to receiving advice or tips on comics or probably anything, then you should take that advice and morph it into your current circumstances. The advice that you receive has to be able to fit in with your life and not the other way around. This is particularly pertinent for things like you should draw for 3 hours every day or whatever. If you can't do that, don't do it. Or if you see an artist's schedule and you try to replicate that in your own life and you're not able to do it, don't do it. Just take some of the bits that you think could work for you and then try and apply it to your life without upending your entire life in the process, because it's not going to work. As someone with experience, that it's not going to work. And the only thing it will do is make your circumstances harder than they need to be. What's the best advice you've received this year? Let me know in the comments and let's share our collective wealth with each other. And if you want some advice on how to use 3D in your comics, then watch this video next, because it's not cheating.